All right, another round, spotlights. And we have here with us today, Nicola Peel. And for those that may not know yet, Nicola is a professional speaker, solutionist, environmentalist, and also a One Planet ambassador. She has a diploma in business studies from Northbrook College in the UK, and in her free time, Nicola volunteers from eco-brics to building rainwater systems and everything in between for the little that I know. So she's going to tell us more about all of this in a minute. We met through UK permaculture community. So if you don't know if you have a community of permaculture near you, please check it out. And there is also a map of the UK permaculture, and it goes beyond that. So you can go and see where maybe something that you can tap in the world, because it's better together and we can learn a lot from each other. So before I deviate, that's just a really tiny intro. So Nicola, please tell us a little bit about yourself and what's the story behind your journey into permaculture, really.
Yes, so I studied permaculture almost 20 years ago with the great Patrick Whitefield, who, bless him, who was a great mover and shaker in this land. And so, yeah, as you said, my job title is I'm a solutionist, and permaculture falls into that area as being solutions based. And a couple of the projects, which, as you mentioned, that I've worked on, going back quite a long time ago, was working with eco-brics, turning rubbish, not in this country, but in other countries where they use the rivers as a way of disposing. I taught them how to build, and we ended up building schools and restaurants and turning thousands of plastic bottles into buildings. And so that was kind of like some of the bigger projects that I've been working on, is like bringing some like practical basic skills into rural communities as well. And more recently, since 2016, I have been focused on agroforestry as a way of preventing tropical deforestation and regenerating the soil.
And your days have double the time, I think, with the amount of things that you get involved in. It has to be that you have double hours a day. So before we get to the core of the session that we're doing today, just tell us a little bit, whereabouts in the world are you? Which kind of time zone are you?
So I am in the South Downs National Park in the south of England. So it's a temperate zone. It's on our wetlands. Our river is the River Arun, and it's also one of the sunniest parts of England, being close to the south coast.
And what does that mean when you're working with the soil?
Well, there's many ways that we have to look at our piece of land, and that's a big part of permaculture, is to observe first and to know the piece of land that you're living on, because there's no point planting trees that come from the tropics outside in a cold temperate zone. A lot of them they're just not going to make it. You've got to know how much water, how much sun, and what kind of soil you have to ensure that it's appropriate what you grow.
Yeah, and that must be really quite difficult. I know my patience level was just to observe things. It's something that I'm trying to get much better at. But you get a wealth of experience just from doing that, don't you? Like you said, around planting the right things, doing the right things in the right place. Yeah, cool. Okay, so as we have sort of permaculture learners on our channel and practitioners, what would you say is the most tangible way you can define permaculture?
Common sense. As great Patrick said, when I said to him after I did my PDC, my permaculture design course, I said, Patrick, this is just common sense. And he said, yes, but common sense is not common. So that really explains it. It's like, okay, we're in a world right now where we got to teach common sense, and so really kind of like also looking at permaculture not just as people in a garden growing organic food, understanding it much more as a system. It's a system that, yes, works with the land. It also works with the water. It works with the landscapes. It works with the people. It's an integrated system. So it's really kind of important to kind of broaden it out so we don't get stuck in the trap of thinking permaculture is just, keyhole gardens and beds and
Mm.
rainwater systems.
So what are some tangible ways to look at that system perspective in, let's say, urban tiny garden?
So I saw a great example of permaculture in the city one time, and it was so tiny there was no garden, but they had a wall, and so they just used the waste that was around, which was a load of like plastic containers. They cut them lengthways, and they strung together these kind of plastic containers and bottles, and they made a vertical growing area on the side of a wall. And so, using, what's around that, it doesn't mean to say you have to have a big piece of garden. If you've got a south facing wall or you've got a roof, then you can garden. And so I don't think we need to be limited by the idea of having to have, a garden per se. We can grow in containers, we can grow on walls and roofs, and really make the use of the space that we have. Even if it's just growing sprouts on your windowsill, that's where we've got to bring it down to, is like keeping it really real so that everyone can do it.
From your perspective, I mean, over 20 years working in this subjects, what sort of common confusions or conflicts do you see when it comes on sort of these conditions that can create abundance, not just on things that you can eat, but also with each other?
Well, there's always going to be an old way of thinking where, people are still stuck to using agrochemicals, fertilizers, pesticides, digging and plowing and carrying on like their generation know. So that can be challenging, is a lot of people don't want to change. They don't want to hear the new information and the new ways. So of course there can be conflict there. So the best way is always just to lead by example, so that they end up having a look and seeing, like a friend of mine, she has an amazing permaculture garden on an allotment. And there was a lot of old boys that have, been on that allotment for a very long time. And they were like, what's she doing? It's all messy and it's no good and rah, rah, rah. But when she was the only person that didn't get potato blight, because she had it so well mulched and so well manured that the plants were so healthy, they didn't get it. That's when they all kind of were like, well, hang on, we've had all our potatoes wiped out. Why haven't you? That's when they came round to wanting to know what she was doing. So that's really is always the best way, isn't it? Just by getting on and just doing your thing. And then when it works, then people are, hey, well, what's going on here?
I find not trying to convince people works quite well, and just being very open and relaxed, and the curiosity will trickle in. I tend to say that I'm a lazy gardener, not necessarily lazy, but I just work with what it is, and sometimes doing less, it gives you more. And so they can see that my lazy approach actually gives me quite a good results. So then the questions comes. I find it a much easier, less resistant path into regenerate our own neighborhoods.
Yeah, I thought it was quite funny at the beginning, you're saying this new approach to the way that we garden, but actually I'm pretty sure if we went back hundreds of years ago, way before, I mean thousands if not, way before, we started doing mass ways of growing crops and all of this other stuff that we do, that actually it made sense. Like we worked with the land, we worked with the way that the water came down the mountain, we did all these things, but yet we've sort of forgotten them. So it's reminding people, like you say, and sort of going against the grain that actually is the grain anyway. For some reason, as human beings, we seem to make it as hard as possible for ourselves in a lot of ways that we sort of live and work, which is quite interesting way of doing things. Anyway, so let's dig into a bit more detail. I was going to say it's a pun, but it's kind of a little bit against some of the stuff we do, so I apologize for that. So what are the key items to keep in mind then when you're getting started into this new way of working?
Well, another one of the permaculture principles is slow and simple solutions. So not kind of deciding you're going to take it all on at once. And so, you know, after you've had the observation, you're like, okay, well, I'm just going to do this little bit at a time and keep it really manageable, because I think there's a real sense of overwhelm. And that's why it's much better if you can find a community garden where people work together. This idea of, you know, one person in their backyard, you know, we've got to move on from that. It's much more productive and much more fun to be working together, and you can achieve so much more. So that would definitely be my advice, is to, you know, get a group of people together and work on it together.
So how do you, I mean, just I suppose a practical question around that is, how do you get people to actually slow down? Because you're in a world where we get notifications, we get lots of things flung at us left, right and center all the time. I even feel like I speak much faster than I did 20 years ago. So how do you get them to do that, or help them do that?
Well, we have to remind ourselves that sometimes we can actually go out without our phone. That's a big one, you know. It's actually, we have to remind people that, hey, how about you go for a walk without your phone? And when you don't have the phone, that immediately stops you falling into your default mode, and coming into remembering to just be and not always be doing. And so, you know, I'm either very, very busy doing or trying to slot in a quick bit of being, where if I don't take my phone out and I go for a walk, then, and I'll, you know, take a few moments to sit down somewhere, then if I have my phone in my pocket, there's quite likely that I'm going to get it out. And, you know, I'm just going to take a photo or whatever that may be. Oh, I'm just going to write a note, or, you know, even if it wasn't to just go on social media, there's still a zillion other things we can do. So by stopping that, it kind of enforces you to actually slow down and just to be more in nature. And do a little experiment with yourself. If you can actually be without your phone and sit still in nature for 20 minutes, then you'll see a shift. They say it takes that long for the baseline to change, for nature to just trust you, because always the humans are busy and noisy and doing. But if you just sit still for 20 minutes and observe, then you start to drop in to a whole other reality.
That's just such a brilliant tip, and such an easy one that we should all be able to do, is just go leave the house without our phone and sit for 20 minutes. It's a sad world where we can't do that, really, or don't do that, rather. We definitely can do it. So what other things have you seen working well then within, if we're going back to that small space design, small space sort of permaculture? Yeah, what have you seen that's been working well in a tiny kind of space, but also maybe on farms or anything else in between? Like, how do you, can you give us some examples?
Well, the tiny spaces, I'm really inspired by, say, this vertical and this roof growing. I did see, actually, in London one time, I was invited to go and see a garden on top of a roof that was actually selling straight into the supermarket beneath it. So it was growing on, it was a collective of people that had used this supermarket roof space. They were growing and they were actually selling, you know, 0 miles, just a few meters beneath them. So seeing that in practical action was obviously really inspiring. And then on a large scale, seeing some mob grazing. And I recently went to a regenerative farm to see, you know, what they were doing there. And it was, you know, they've been for hundreds of years, you know, traditional farmers. And then this kind of like young son did a permaculture course, and he learned about mob grazing and you know, how to build the soil and herbal lays and how to move the cattle like they would have done once upon a time. They would have been moved on by wolves. They would have like worked together. And so that's how they do it, but with an electric fence. You know, you keep them in a certain area, they graze hard there, and then you move them on to the next area and you keep moving them on. So they eat everything, and that includes lots of herbs that they wouldn't eat if they didn't have to. So there's loads of benefits. And when I asked the father, you know, the old farmer, what have you seen in this new way of working? And he said, well, last summer, when there was a drought, our neighbour's farm, which had also been sprayed by agrochemicals, he said, well, it saved us a lot of money because we're not doing any spraying, but it was absolutely yellow. And he said the fence line dividing their two farms, his side was green and his neighbour's was totally dried out. So for him, seeing that with his own eyes was able to really show him that, okay, this is a massive shift in the way that we're treating our land, and being able to visually see that is always the best way to learn.
And that's amazing, just in 1 year as well. That's incredible, isn't it, that it could make such a shift? Because often you sort of hear about things, and I always imagine it's at least, you know, 3 or 4 years that the land starts to repair itself. But nature is just so powerful, isn't it, in its regenerating itself. That's really, yeah, I mean, it's amazing. It's really inspiring.
I was intrigued about the community garden scale. So we talked about tiny, we talked about massive, or hopefully not so massive. And then at community scale, anything specific that you've seen working really well?
Yes, the Petworth Community Garden, shout out to them. They have a brilliant Growing for All scheme. Kate Raquel, Kate Green now, she's a permaculture teacher. She's now teaching at Westdean College, and her community garden, it's 2 allotments. One is disabled access. The whole thing has been designed for people in wheelchairs. And the other one is for people of all abilities that come with their carers. And it is so busy that, you know, it's almost like too successful. The local doctor's surgery does a lot of social prescribing, sending people down to her gardens. She's had so many incredible results for people attending her garden. So, you know, hearing her stories is always really moving. And the one that just comes to me now is her telling me about a guy who was in his 40s, and he had literally never walked alone. He'd always held on very tightly to his carer's hand. And that day in the community garden, everybody was digging up the potatoes, and he was watching the others dig the potatoes up. And for the first time ever, he pulled away from his carer's hand and he went down and he started picking potatoes up. And he walked out of that garden and he didn't need to hold hands like he had done his whole entire life. So that real way of social therapy, of, you know, getting people connected to the land, so that he was just so focused that that's what he wanted to do, he could forget for a moment all of, you know, his troubles. So, you know, hearing some of her real stories with people working in her community garden, she also ends up, you know, having a huge amount of surplus food, which is given away in the summer. So, you know, it's really become a real good shining light of what a permaculture thriving garden can look like.
Amazing. I love the day where we're actually prescribed green spaces and blue spaces, where we can actually, you know, go outside and be like, oh, this is good for my well-being. We know it is, we talk about it, but it's not something that's ever kind of given as a, you know, doctor's orders. And obviously none of us are doctors here or or medics, but it just proves that just makes such a difference, doesn't it? I mean, it's just, yeah, that's amazing. Wonderful story. Thank you. So one more question then from myself in terms of stuff that works. We've talked a lot about the stuff that works, especially in community, small spaces, large spaces. But in perspective of what hasn't worked, from your experience, what are those sorts of things so that we can avoid them? Life isn't long enough to make all the mistakes again.
Well, the big one that's very difficult to avoid are people. And, you know, there's always going to be difficult people to work with. And, you know, and that's really where we have to learn, you know, other skills to be able to learn. You know, there's Luby that works with people in permaculture, and there's, you know, NVC, nonviolent communication, and there are those that are working in that area of, you know, actually there's the people and permaculture, because a garden is only as successful as the people that are working together. So I think that's something that really has to be, you know, addressed, is, you know, also giving that time to ensure that there's a social aspect. It's not all work and no play. You know, the importance of, you know, having tea and cake can be underestimated, but, you know, that's really a vital part of gardening, is also kind of that socializing and that stopping again and literally taking time to smell the roses.
Mm. Yeah, and you sort of like triggered a thought in my own head when last year I remember we had like hundreds and hundreds of raspberries, which was great, amazing, and in fact, and they were really expensive in shops. And so we said to our neighbours, just we cannot eat, or we don't have enough freezer space for all these raspberries. I don't think we had like a kilo a day or 2 kilos. I don't know, it was a lot anyway, which is amazing, sounds like a dream, but after a while it was quite time consuming to go and pick them all. So we said to our neighbours, just come round and pick raspberries. Out of all the neighbours, I don't know, 5 or 6 lots of close neighbours, only 1 lot came round. And I thought it would be great if we could normalise that it's okay to go into gardens, it's okay to have this social aspect, this community, to just go and do that, because that's actually a good thing. And to stop this barrier, this weird barrier, especially in the UK that we have. Maybe it is just the UK, but I don't know what it is, like, oh, it's very polite for you to kind of invite me round, but actually I won't, and all of this sort of stuff, when it's actually, no, come round, take some of my food, because actually it's a pleasure to be able to give it away, and it gives us joy. So sorry, just going off on a trail, but yeah.
Yeah, but I think it's really, you know, how we think about the gluts of, you know, it can become really overwhelming to have this, you know, huge amount of surplus, and it's like, okay, well, you know, what are we going to do with all this? And so for Kate in her garden, you know, it's turned into jams and chutneys, so that's a way of the garden kind of self-supporting itself, by selling the jams and the chutneys to keep, you know, buying more seeds and keep it, you know, circular. And then teaching people also what else can be done, you know, how, you know, things can be dried and pickled and preserved. And so I think that's a big part that we all really need to kind of like look at, because there's nothing, but I have a crazy goji berry bush. People are like, whoa, I had no idea you could even grow goji berries in England. It's like, yeah, and when they do, they go crazy. So, you know, it's a bit like, oh my God, you know, I've got to pick them, and there's zillions of them. And, but, you know, now I'm really, really happy. And I every morning have my goji berries on my breakfast. And it's like, yeah. Once you've done it, you know, you really appreciate it throughout the year. And so, you know, it's something really special about, you know, in the middle of winter, being able to have some fruit that came from your garden.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And if we continue in the positive, uplifting thoughts, what has worked really well from what you put in place where you live? Something specific, tangible, that maybe you can share with the rest of us. Something simple that we could give it a try.
Taking cuttings of wine berries. And yeah, I hadn't kind of thought of it, and that was dear Maddie Harland, the editor of Permaculture magazine, and Maddie gave me the wineberry, and you know, and it just accidentally, one of them had fallen over and just rooted itself, and I kind of pulled it out and I was like, oh look, it's just rooted itself. So now I do that every year. I just bend one over and just kind of cover it over with something and just let it root itself. So I suppose that was a good, simple tip.
Brilliant. And keep your seeds on that note. So we're coming at the time. Thank you ever so much to spend this time with us. These conversations go way too fast for what I would like, but how can we learn more about what you do and the work that you do?
So my website's my name, nicolapeel.com. I also have a Patreon account, which is Patreon Solutionist, and I interview also interesting people every month. And I have the Solutions podcast, and it's a bit about, you know, kind of like what the work is that I'm currently working on and keeping people informed with kind of the latest stories. And that's also a way of crowdfunding myself. And so, yeah, that's really kind of the best ways to find out what I'm doing, is to go onto my website or find out on Patreon, Solutionist.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. A tease as well from us. In a couple of weeks, we're going to have another round of Sustainable You videos. And thank you, Nicola. Thank you, Helen. Thank you, all of you, to make this happen. And see you very soon.